Good afternoon. My name is Rieser and I'm the lead consultant on this project of developing inclusion in South Sudan. On it I have been assisted by Alex Horschild from ENET, and our research assistant has been Vera Hendricks. Our mentor and manager has been Paul Mabatier, and our senior consultant Nafisa Babu, who has given useful comments. So I'm going to give a talk this afternoon to help people understand the policy documents that we've put together, and the title of the talk is Presentation on National Policy on Inclusive Education in South Sudan. And you will find more detail of this in these 4 documents which are available and are going to be on the website. First of all, the National Policy of Inclusive Education, Achieving Education for All Children in South Sudan. This was produced by the Technical Committee with support from Paul Mabatier and myself and Alexander, and is the key document. There are some questions at the back for you to respond to. In order to understand these and where we got to this position, starting from a seminar we held with the Technical Committee in Nairobi in January, we also have produced this document, which is the Path to Inclusion in South Sudan, which develops the idea of how we can develop an inclusive education system for all children, and particularly children with disabilities across South Sudan, and puts forward a 5-year program and what will be involved in that. We've also, in doing this, produced a research in 9 counties, 54 schools, focus groups and interviews with individual head teachers, and that is contained how we did it, how we set it up, the results and the tools that we used in this document. Report on the gathering and analysis of information, and that's available as an annex to the report, and then published separately but also an annex to the report is Why Inclusive Education, a Light for the World publication which is already on the internet, which explains the main reasons why we think inclusive education is the way forward in South Sudan. Okay, now to start with, in recent years there have been quite a lot of changes in the way the world thinks about disability, and this shifting focus is particularly brought out at the UN. The UN defined disability as an evolving concept, and that disability results from the interaction of persons with impairments and attitudinal and environmental barriers that hinder their full and effective participation in society on an equal basis with others. This is moving on from the old medical model definition, which saw the problem in the person, to an interactive definition which sees the barriers of attitude and environment as important in hindering the progress of disabled people around the world. This has been linked to a paradigm shift which is contained in the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, where the person with disabilities are not viewed as an object of charity, medical treatment and social protection, but rather as subjects with rights who are capable of claiming those rights and making decisions for their lives based on the free and informed consent, as well as being active members of society. You can find more about the UN Convention on www.un.org/disabilities, and there are plenty of useful documents there. Now, at the same time that this definition came out, the World Health Organization and the World Bank re-evaluated in 2011 disability, the World Report on Disability, and in that they identified more than 1 billion people who would be covered by the definition of disability. And if we look at the convention, we can see that already 158 countries around the world have become signatories to the UN Convention, and 147, including the European Union, have actually ratified the Convention. What does it mean to ratify the Convention? Well, it means that it becomes law in your country. But even when you sign it, it means that you don't do anything that works against the principles outlined in the Convention. There's also the optional protocol which allows individuals, when they've exhausted the law in their country, to go to the International Committee on Disability Rights in Geneva and take a case there. At the heart of the Convention is this paradigm shift from the medical to the social model, and we'll be looking at how that impacts as we plan and develop education in South Sudan. The next slide shows the old way of thinking, which is really the medical model or charity model. And if we put this in a child context, the child with an impairment is seen as the problem. They don't respond, they cannot learn. They need special teachers, they need a special environment. They are different from other children. They have special needs, they need special equipment, and they can't get to school, they can't really be in school with others. So the problem is entirely vested in the child, and this may have made sense 50 or 100 years ago when we were developing rehabilitative technology and trying to develop supports for children. But it also led to a fast track to segregated treatment, and indeed most of the research we have around the world demonstrates that children did not learn very well and were not fitted to be with their peers in the world, and certainly didn't develop the skills and qualifications that they need in order to have their own livelihood. On the other hand, the newer diagram addresses the barriers of attitude, environment and organisation. It's based on the social or human rights model, and in the centre here we have the school as problematic rather than the child, and what needs to change is the school and the school system rather than the child themselves. So we start by identifying barriers and then we come up with solutions. So the sorts of solutions that we find in schools in South Sudan are negative attitudes of peers, parents, teachers and the community in general, poor quality training for teachers, so they've not had as part of their training to work with children with disabilities, a lack of teaching aids and equipment. Everything has been produced in a standard way, take textbooks. There's recently been a large amount of money expended by DFID on producing 10 million textbooks for South Sudan, but none of these were produced in accessible format, easy read, large print, braille and so on, or even electronically. Teachers and schools are not supported enough, so we have to find ways of building support systems around the schools. Many children drop out, particularly those who find that their needs are not being met in the classroom, therefore they drop out. Many schools they can't even get to because of transport problems and inaccessible environments, and the teachers don't necessarily have the right methods. Most often, where 1/3 of our teaching force in South Sudan are people who've not gone on a teacher training course, they are teaching in the way that they were taught at school themselves. So all of these are barriers, but by moving them away from the child to the school and the school environment and those who have control over that both at county, state and national level, we are making the problem solvable. We cannot change the children, but we can change these systems. So that's why this is very important. Now, this shift into practice in education, putting this shift into practice, the International Disability Alliance, which represents those billion disabled people around the world, says that special education in developed countries, but also in developing countries, can help to create and reiterate negative stereotypes towards students and persons with disabilities. Additionally, the removal of children with disabilities from the mainstream education denies those students without disabilities access to those children and creates and perpetuates stigma. They go on to say that the social model of disability, or the human rights model, which is contained in the UN CRPD, recognises the combination of a person's impairment situated in a discriminating society requires changing the social system, which includes the education system. Special education today reproduces discriminatory social systems by reinforcing the assumptions that individuals with special and specific characteristics do not fit in, and thus places them in a separate situation. Now, we don't have a lot of special schools in South Sudan. However, many of the teachers who have been trained in special ed, have been trained in this special ed model rather than an inclusion model, and therefore one of our key issues is going to be to change that as we move on. Of course, all teachers also need disability equality training, and ideally this should be delivered by disabled people themselves who've been empowered to see that it's not their impairments that are the problem, but other people's attitude and the barriers that those lead to. So we need to have that in place as well as we move forward. Now let's look at what this UN Convention says, in particular with regard to education. It requires all signatories, and incidentally the interim government of South Sudan, before the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, did actually say that it was signing up to this UNCRPD, though the government we have at the moment hasn't yet moved to doing that, but it has signified its intention of ratifying this convention, and therefore anything we plan for education for disabled children or children with disabilities in South Sudan should be predicated on this convention. So the first part, it says, it requires all signatories to ensure that all disabled children and young people can fully participate in the state education system, and that this should be an inclusive education system at all levels. The development by persons with disabilities of their personality, talents, creativity, as well as their mental and physical abilities should be to their fullest potential. This right is to be developed in inclusive primary and secondary education system from which disabled people should not be excluded. So currently we have very few children with disabilities in South Sudan in education, and we have a huge hill to climb to get them in. But there is no way that we could incorporate those children in education by setting up separate schools or even separate classrooms. They need to be part of the mainstream in the same location. But they also need to have reasonable accommodations provided for their individual requirements and support provided in individualised programs. Now that may seem like a tall order in classes of 60, 80 or 100, but it can be done. And the UNESCO Bangkok booklets, which are available on the web, show how you can actually develop inclusive teaching in large classes. We also go on then to see that we need to have also available for those who are blind, which is a large portion of disabled children in South Sudan, perhaps up to a third according to Sight Savers, and a fewer number who are deaf, affected mainly by malaria, but will need sign language. They'll also need augmented and facilitated communication. We need good role models for disabled children growing up, and we need to really make a special effort to get disabled students into teacher training and then employed as teachers, so that disabled children coming to school can see disabled adults in a useful role as teachers. We need to train professionals and staff who work at all levels of the education system. Such training shall incorporate disability awareness or equality training and the use of appropriate augmentative, alternative modes and means and forms of communication, education techniques and material to support persons with disabilities. What has been lacking to date in the teacher training that has been taking place is a clear module on what we mean by inclusive education and the knowledge, skills and understanding that is required to deliver it in the classroom. So we may have to rely on pulling ourselves up by our own bootstraps for the existing teachers and for head teachers to lead school development for all of the teachers in their schools to get to this. And part of that will need to be also focusing on Article 8, awareness raising, which also requires state parties, which is the government, fostering at all levels of the education system, including in all children from an early age, an attitude of respect for the rights of persons with disabilities. This will just not happen given traditional attitudes and views that exist in many of the hundreds of cultures across South Sudan which see disability as a negative thing, as a punishment from parents, as something that is a curse that a witch doctor or someone else has put on. This has to be broken through, and a realisation in all children and young people, and indeed all adults, that disability is just part of life's rich pattern and they better get used to it. As we go on talking about teacher training, we will need to have a twin-track approach to introducing all teachers, both those in service and those who are undergoing additional training or pre-service training. 2 tracks. The first track, which is inclusion for all, which will ensure that the systems that they are going to be in charge of and teaching in are able to meet the needs of all learners. And then a second track, which needs to be a mandatory unit for all teachers, will be an impairment-specific accommodations and support track. I can explain in more detail what I mean with that by these slides, which this is the first track, and this must be and is based on the policy guidelines for inclusion from UNESCO, and makes it clear and was agreed by 152 states in 2008 in Geneva that we need to have the following principles and foundations as a basis for education for all: equality and valuing difference, identifying barriers and finding solutions, collaborative learning, that is support from peers. So it's not just the teacher who's doing the support for learners, but we use different methods in the classroom so that we have groups, we have pairs, we have whole class teaching, all of which is appropriate to supporting different learners learning at their own pace. And so peer support and collaborative learning is very important. We also need to have the curriculum differentiated and flexible, both in the curriculum materials but also in any assessments that we have. We need to have a stimulating and interesting multisensory learning environment. We know that children learn in different ways, and this goes across all groups of children around the world. Some learn by visual cues, some learn by auditory cues, some learn by doing, and some learn by a combination of all of these. So we have to have classrooms that are interesting, where there is material on the walls, where there are experiments and hands-on things that children can do, where there are sounds and music, and we learn through songs which teach some of the principles that we maybe find it hard to remember, and by drama and doing. We need an anti-bias curriculum which challenges racism, intertribal conflict, that challenges gender discrimination, that challenges homophobia and discrimination against people because of their sexual orientation. One that will be difficult in Africa, but we cannot say without that we have an inclusive system. It will be one for governments to grasp the nettle of, many of whom are going in the opposite direction at the moment. But we cannot say that we have a human rights environment where 10% of the population are denied their expression. We also include in the anti-bias curriculum all those who learn and think and speak or act in different ways because of various impairments that they have. We need to have at the heart of this track 1 a child-centred pedagogy, not the teacher-centred pedagogy with the teacher speaking from the top, rote learning, but one where it meets the learning needs of each child. And we need quality education requiring rigour, effort for each child to achieve their potential. Much of the efforts of the first and second decades of education for all have been squandered on poor level quality access. You can come on to me now if you like. Poor level quality access. So many children across southern Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, have dropped out or have achieved at grade 3 or 4 not even basic literacy or numeracy. And that is to do with not having these other principles in place. If you have child-centred learning, if you have differentiated learning and a flexible curriculum, you can't possibly have the bulk of children not progressing in their learning. In order to do this, of course, means we need a skilled teaching force that is respected by the community and paid sufficiently so that they don't go off often during their term time, or even appear at school in a drunken manner or behave in a bad way using corporal punishment to punish children. All of these things are against a child-centred approach, but we do need to recognise it is going to cost money to do this, and we will have to shift in South Sudan from 2.5 times the money for education in defence, so that we have 2.5 times as much money at least spent on education as defence. And that's going to require some hard political decisions by your leaders. But those changes will need to be lobbied for if there's any chance of peace and any chance of this system actually being established. We go on to the second track, which is accommodations that different impairment groups need with their specific needs. So if we take blind and visually impaired students, they will need access to Braille, and they'll need access to people who understand Braille and can teach them the Braille alphabet and then the contracted forms of it. We'll need Braille printers and Braille and tactile printers that can produce maps and diagrams in a raised format. We'll need tactile maps, therefore, and tapes and text-to-talk systems on the increasing amount of IT equipment that we will be getting into schools over the next 20 years. So when we're buying in IT, we need to make sure that it is adaptable and can be used for text-to-talk functions. We'll need mobility training so that children who are blind have confidence to move around in their environment. We'll need, for those who are partially sighted, large print, magnification, orientation and auditory environments for them. Let's look at a second group, the deafblind, a very small group, but those who both cannot see and cannot hear will need deaf-blind language, tactile environments and particular interpreters to work on a one-handed sign language system. The deaf and hearing impaired will need access to sign language, and we are some way away from having a unified South Sudanese sign language at the present time. That will need to be fast-tracked and then taught, and developing interpreters, so both teachers and support assistants in schools can actually deliver this. We'll need all children to learn oral methods of lip speaking and finger spelling. We'll need for an increasing number of children who will, as the technology develops, be able to manage with, who are not profoundly deaf but just have hearing loss. We'll need hearing aid, and we'll need technical people to support those. And in order for them not to be missing out, they'll need to sit at the front where they can get cues, they'll need to have buddies who can support them, and they'll need lots of visual cues around to explain what's going on. Physical impairment, well, our biggest barrier in South Sudan is most of the schools have not been built in a way that's accessible, and we will have to find ways of converting our existing school building stock to make it accessible for wheelchair users and those who use crutches or sticks to get around, so we will be able to get into the classroom. But it is also, access is about creating a light environment where people who are partially sighted can see, so that might mean painting the inside of our classrooms. It may also mean that specialist equipment that they may need can be kept in a secure place, so it isn't mislaid or stolen as soon as it's been invested in. And we will need personal assistance to help people with carrying and fetching things, and in some situations writing notes for them. And we will need people to administer medicines and people to help and transport methods to get children to and from school, which is a big barrier. Those with specific learning difficulties have general cognitive awareness but are stuck on not being able to see the letters on the page, or the numbers don't add up when they try and do it. They have what we call a specific learning difficulty. Often just a coloured overlay will help to stop the type swimming in front of their eyes, but they will also benefit from an easy read version of the text that the rest of the class are using. It's reinforced by a tape recorder or text-to-talk. This will help. And also many computers now have spell checkers on, and children with specific learning difficulties benefit a great deal by having an automatic spell check on their work. And when learning abstract concepts such as geometry or volume, having a three-dimensional object can be very useful. These things sound expensive, but they don't need to be. The local community can be employed to make these things out of wood and other materials that naturally occur. Speech and communication. Many children have difficulties with speaking or not speaking at all, and yet they can sign. They can use talkers and switching, and they can use information grids, which can be as small as a yes-no part of a sheet which they can point to, or we can have pictograms which go into more and more detail so they can actually communicate. A visual timetable is also useful for this group. Those with more general learning difficulties need things in smaller steps and simplified. It doesn't mean they can't make progress. They can make progress, but they need the teacher to break things down into smaller steps. Pictograms can be very useful. Easy read material. Scaffolding, such as the language that you're likely to use in that particular lesson. Say you're doing a social science lesson on the environment. To have the 10 key words that the children are going to need to write on a pre-prepared sheet so that they can actually use those to do their writing is what we mean by scaffolding. Also, many children like simplified forms of signs such as Makaton and using symbols. And again, concrete objects can be very useful. Mental health and behaviour are an ongoing issue, and particularly where we have a large number of children who've been traumatised due to the 40 years of civil conflict that have been going on and are still going on in South Sudan. This has a big impact on the mental health of young people and indeed their parents. We need counselling and personal support. We need differentiated behaviour policies. Most importantly, we need empathy. We need love in our schools so that children feel welcomed and supported. We need, for some children, a quiet, chill-out space when it all gets too much for them. And we need their peers to act as friends and supporters, buddies and circles of friends. And we need a structured day. So those two tracks are the essential things that all teachers need to be aware of and master so that they can actually teach the inclusive class. Why should we do this? Well, if we look at this data here, we can see that the traditional rote learning system that we have in South Sudan, despite the big increase until 2010 of up to 1.4 million children in school, we notice that the numbers actually completing primary education is 21% males, and only 9.3% of females. That's after the first 8 years of school, and that in the dropout rates in primary grades 1 to 7 are very large, within no year being less than 15%, in a number of years more than 30%. The net effect of that is that only 10% of the children who enroll in primary 1 will actually finish primary 8. And that's before they move on to the next 4 years in secondary education. The figures for disabled children are actually much more worrying. If we look at these figures, assuming the World Health estimate that at least 15% of children in a poor country like South Sudan, which has had a lot of war and famine and hunger, and disease such as malaria and infestational worms and so on, nodding disease, epilepsy and so on, then at least 15% of the children in the country are likely to be disabled or have a significant life-limiting impairment. Taking the 2010 figures